I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Charlene. Welcome to Empowered, Life Lessons of Everyday Women.
Each episode, you are going to meet an amazing woman who has struggled through challenges both in her home life and work life and has become very successful. Meet Michele B. Casually seek advice from all walks of life. Michele spent her entire career in public service. She joined the Foreign Service as a Vice Consul. She worked overseas in a variety of areas, including as the ambassador to the Kingdom of Lesotho. She retired as the Assistant Secretary of Consular Affairs, a presidential appointment. So, grab a cup of coffee, get in a comfy chair as we talk to Michele. Welcome, Michele. We are so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be invited.
So if you were able to go back and talk to your 20-year-old self and give her some advice, what would that be?
Well, as I look back at how I was thinking things through at that age, and even at later years as I was working, I think the first thing that comes to mind is to seek advice from people, to talk to people, not necessarily in a way that would look like a formal, intentional thing to them, but just the people you know, the people that you know from church or neighbors, family members, professors if you're in college or university. And to ask them questions like, how did you get started? How did you get interested in what you're doing now? You'd find that many people are doing careers, doing things that they didn't set out to do. They found it later. But I do believe that when I was that age, I felt if I asked a lot of questions, I would look like I didn't know what I wanted, and I didn't have a sense of who I was. And so I was shy about asking those questions.
But if you ask them in the sense that you're curious, you want to listen to what other people have because you want to learn from them, not necessarily because you have self-doubt or you don't know where you want to go, but because you're truly interested in how they got where they were, it's amazing what you can learn.
So, if you ask it in terms of tell me, I'd like to know you better. Tell me more.
I think a lot of conversations can just be had right over the lunch table. I know that sometimes when I've gone to conferences, for instance, and you go to the conference and you're learning whatever information is being given to you, and then you have a conversation with somebody after the conference and you pick up a nugget or something that's just so invaluable and you're like, that's my aha moment, and they truly are there. But sometimes just having a conversation like we're doing today is all you need.
So you've dedicated your entire life to public service, civil service. And thank you for that. We need more people like that in our country. What inspired you to get involved with civil service at such a young age?
I worked with many people in the civil service, but I was actually in a slightly smaller subset of foreign service officers. And name suggests we expect to spend half or more of our careers outside of the United States, representing the United States. When I was in high school, I was thinking about being a journalist. My dad and his father were journalists, and I liked to write. I was on the school newspaper. And so that was kind of what I was thinking about. And in a way, the career in diplomacy that I ended up in is a lot like being a journalist. Some of the skills that I saw that I had, I was able to use. While I was in high school, it was the Nixon administration, and my mother was working at a private research organization, and her boss was nominated by the president to serve as an assistant secretary of state, and she went with him to the State Department. But she just loved it. And she talked a lot at home about the team of people she was working with. I remember her saying it once, but she probably said it more than once. These are interesting, smart people who have traveled and know a lot of things. They're hardworking. They're fun. You would be good at this. And so she very much was at the heart of my learning about the State Department and getting interested in it.
So what's your biggest influence in your career?
apart from my mother, who, really was huge because she earlier in her own life had lived abroad and worked abroad, opened my eyes to the fact that that it's a big world and lots of places you can go. The summer after I graduated from high school, I started working for the Department of State because they had they still have a summer program for interns. And I very much encourage anybody who's thinking about the State Department. It's a program that's open to college and graduate students. And it gives you a good introduction to get a sense of the kind of work we do and the kind of people that you'd be working with. In the end, I worked at the Department of State every summer through college. And January was sort of an interterm period when people could do different things. And I worked at the Department of State. So it was 4 or 5 months a year, or maybe 3 or 4, that I was at State. And I really did get a good sense of the work that they did. And I never, during that time or during my career, I literally never ran into anybody who said, when I think back, but I wish I just stayed home, let's say, and never joined the Foreign Service, never tried to do the kind of work that we do. People, by and large, find it very stimulating. I literally would have done it for free.
Wow, that says a lot right there.
I mean, life is life, and there could be times when things are a lot more challenging. But in terms of the years of the career, people would look back and say, yeah, I'm glad I did this. It's been stimulating. It's been challenging. And it's very rewarding emotionally. You really are representing the country and helping American citizens in a variety of ways.
Right, right. So your first position was at the embassy, U.S. Embassy in Guatemala.
Right.
Sounds very interesting. How did you get that position, Michele?
Well, the way it works is that you go through a training period at the department as they bring you on board, and then they give you an assignment. For your first 2 assignments, you don't get to pick, although they gave us a list, and you could indicate that this was a high for you or a medium or a low. I think I put everything high. Guatemala was a lovely place to go. It's a beautiful country. I learned Spanish for the tour, and still, all these years later, I'm able to understand Spanish quite well. I don't speak it as well as I did, but I really spoke it when I was there. And it was very interesting. I was 23, so that's quite young. The average age coming in is 30. I wasn't unique in any way, but a lot of people think that you come into the Foreign Service right out of school. And I looked really young. So a challenge I had was that it was just getting people to take me seriously, to understand that I was there. Again and again, I was asked if I was somebody's daughter. I mean, by the next tour, people were asking if I was somebody's wife. So I felt like, well, okay, at least I'm looking older.
So I have to ask you, because I had a similar situation in that I looked very young when I started out. What did you do to help you get that, I want to say, credibility, so people would respect you for who you are, even though you looked young? What did you do? Anything in particular?
I think the most important thing I did, and by that time, remember, I had worked in the department for the equivalent of a couple of years, and I had worked before that too. What I did felt like it came naturally. I think it was based on some of the experience I'd had. And that was just to be really good at what I did so that I was on time. I was prepared. I had answers when people had questions. I was starting out. I was still very much learning the ropes. My job for the first year was interviewing people who were applying for visas to come to the United States. Guatemala is a country that has a solid middle class that can afford to go to the States on vacation and business trips. And they have a lot of very poor people who cannot afford it and most likely would remain in the States. And my job, along with a couple of other people, was to interview them and make a decision within about 3 minutes of whether they were going to get the visa or not. And it's not something where we say, we'll send you a letter. We tell them right then and there. So learning how to say to someone courteously but firmly, because I wasn't about to have a conversation with them, I'm sorry you don't qualify. You may well qualify some years from now, but you don't right now.
having lived overseas myself, going to another country and understanding the culture can be very challenging. Did they train you or prepare you for those cultural differences? Because I lived overseas in Southeast Asia, very different kind of place and very different kinds of cultural acceptable behavior. Can you speak to that a little bit?
We did get some training. One thing about the job that I was in, when I was interviewing people, I was the American Vice Consul. I had that status and that title and the ability to make the decision. Applicants weren't really challenging me. Sometimes American citizens, if I was assisting an American, they would say, "Can I talk to your dad?" More likely talk to your boss. But they would be more likely to push to go above me and see if they could find someone else. I certainly had learned about the rules of courtesy, greeting people as, senor, senora, buenos dias as they appeared at the window instead of just launching into the questions. So occasionally, not rarely, I ran into situations where people kind of acted like I didn't belong where I was, more because I was female than for my age, especially at that time. So those folks were accustomed to young women my age being married and not working. And so
I think part of that was also cultural, because here you're in a Spanish area.
It was a conservative culture, but it's also a place that puts a very, very high priority on being courteous. And so whatever they were thinking, they would talk to me seriously and courteously. So then it was up to me to show them that I was not wasting their time, that I was there for a good reason and had things to say and things to ask. And if there was friction, I often wasn't even aware of it. And it dissipated very quickly because they got in here. Somebody from the U.S. Embassy wants to talk to me, and I'd like to talk to her.
So you helped Americans who were in a variety of different situations. What is one of the biggest things Americans can do when traveling abroad to stay safe and be prepared?
Well, we have so many resources now that we didn't have back when I was a puppy. One thing is to try to make sure that the people at home know where you're going if you have a fixed itinerary, because we get floods of calls, literally floods, thousands in an hour when there's an emergency overseas, from people who will call and say, "I know my daughter is in London. Can you find out if she's okay?" Increasingly now people can throw an email out there and hear from their daughter. But I often felt that one of our mottos should be, if there's an emergency where you are, call your mom before she calls us. Actually, you're going to worry if you hear there's been a bus crash or a plane crash or there's an earthquake or whatever it is.
Right.
And especially if your loved one is traveling, backpacking or something where you can't be absolutely sure where they are, then that's one of the things that we do, is to try to track people down. There were some things that we could do in an emergency. For example, often people called us because there was an emergency at home and they were trying to reach the person who was traveling to say, "Grandpa had a heart attack," or whatever it might be. And if we didn't know where they were, the one thing that we could do, because we're the government and we could talk to American Express or whatever, is put a hold on their credit card. So the next time they tried to use their credit card, they would get a message, "Urgent, call home." So that's not a method that's available to private citizens, but it's an example of a way that we were able to help people.
I really like to know that. I mean, I'm glad to know that, because I would not have even thought of that before. I know my daughter lived in Taiwan and they had a tsunami come through.
Right.
And my family found out about it before I did. And they were calling me panicked for, about my daughter. And just knowing that those are tools out there for us to call the embassy, and, that there's a way to.
I don't know. One of the things we travel a lot now that we're kind of into that next phase of our life. And I always make sure that I send all the information to our two boys, just in case, so they know where we are, how to reach us. And I guess maybe that's also from living overseas. When we lived overseas, I always carried a paper copy of our passport.
Yep, absolutely.
And only because you could get stopped somewhere, and it happened to us when we were on a boat traveling on a recreational thing, and they want to know who you are and where you're from and what your passport number is. And if you don't have that information, now with cell phones and things like that, devices now, it's a lot easier to store that information. But at the time, even when
I still carry a a paper copy.
So I also know that you helped a lot with foreign adoption issues. That's very near and dear to my heart as well, because my sister adopted a little baby girl from China. What seems to be the most common issue, and are there things that couples can do better to prepare themselves for that foreign adoption?
Yeah, when I was in Moscow from 96 to 98, and that was a time when many, many children were being adopted, not only from Russia, but there were 8 other new republics that had come out of the Soviet Union, where our embassies were still so small and growing that all of their immigrant visa work was done by us in Moscow. So people adopting in Kazakhstan or Moldova or so forth would have to travel to Moscow and meet with us to get the visa. And that's a long time ago, but we were doing about 5,000 cases a year of children being adopted.
Wow.
And Guangzhou, which did most of the Chinese adoptions, was doing about that many as well. The situation today is very different. And in some ways, it's different for good reasons. There are fewer children being adopted from China because there are fewer being surrendered for adoption. People are being permitted to keep their children. Tragically, there are no adoptions from Russia, and that is political. That's just Putin saying, we're not going to let foreigners adopt our children. But he's not doing anything to get them adopted domestically. They're growing up in orphanages, and when they're 18, they are released, and they have no mom, no dad, no uncles, no buddy. They're on their own. And it's really brutal that he won't allow Europeans or Americans, Canadians to adopt. And it's just Putin being Putin. I mean, there certainly are very, very good resources here in the States to help people prepare to adopt domestically. And there are still adoptions occurring overseas. But I think that my impression was that the adoption agencies did quite a good job of helping people to anticipate the kind of ways that they might help a child who is not only joining a new family, but coming to a new country to adjust.
Mm-hmm. You've worked in a variety of different countries. Several of them were communist at the time or recently became uncommunistic. Is that after the fall? What can you tell us about that environment, the changeover between the communist point of view and the non-communist point of view as they were doing the transition? Do we have any insight?
Well, my husband was also a Foreign Service officer, so we were both working at every post. And we were fortunate, along with our kiddos, to be in Prague at the time of their revolution.
Wow.
That was in 1989. And it's remembered as the Velvet Revolution because it wasn't violent. But we were right there to see how they made the transition from communism to democracy. It was the most inspiring thing I've ever personally experienced. I felt like I had the chance to know our founding fathers in a way, to appreciate the kinds of challenges they faced when they put everything on the line to say, we want to be citizens of and leaders of a democratic country. The Czechs and Slovaks were ready for the transition to a degree because they had been a democratic country until 1948. And it seems like that's a pretty long time. It was 41 years later that they had the switch back to democracy. But all that time, all through those years, parents were quietly telling their children, don't tell anybody we're telling you this. Don't tell your friends, because they could get in trouble. But we are not communists, and the people who are running this country are not our people. And so even quite young people were ready to move into democracy.
I was going to say, again, another overlap. My dad was actually born in the Czech Republic.
Oh, wow.
I had the experience of going to Europe my very first time. I was working in New York City, and my dad decided to go back to Czechoslovakia. The wall was not down yet.
Mm.
So it was very, very interesting for us to go through the country. We had to register with the embassy in Prague. And that might have been right around the time that you were there. And then we were followed. I mean, it was a very strange experience. I'm glad I saw it that way, because then I went back with my husband and we did a bike trip through Czechoslovakia. Hair dye and makeup. But just having experience looking at the bread lines and the food lines and the shop lines.
Yeah, everything. We were there for the last 2 years of communism. And when I arrived, I was pregnant with our third child and far enough along to be visibly pregnant. And so one of my early experiences of seeing this place is really different. And we had served earlier in Yugoslavia, so that was really communism light. They were free to travel and it wasn't the same. I happened to be walking past a lady going the other way who was also pregnant. So I smiled at her, sisterhood, right? She was genuinely shocked. And she looked around to see if anybody had seen me, appear to know her. She crossed.
Oh, wow.
But she could not risk anyone seeing this. It's probably obvious I was a foreigner from whatever I was wearing or whatever. Oh, so how does Svetlana know her? And then she gets called in for questioning. And another thing, speaking of the lines, like every other person living in that country, if I was out on my way to something and someone passed me with a banana in her basket, I went after her and said, "Where'd you get the banana?" So that I could go get in that line. It was never in season in Prague. They don't grow bananas. Mostly you didn't find things unless they were in season.
That makes sense. So one of the things that you talked about kind of struck me, right? Even though it was 40 years, 40 years is not that long of a time when it's still in people's memory. The people that still were under a democratic society were still there. They understood, they knew. And as you said, they kind of kept it alive so that when communism did fall, all of that, the seeds just started sprouting up from the past.
The trick is that nobody knew that anybody else was doing it.
Right.
Because if your child said something at a neighbor's house about, oh, mommy says X or Y, you could get reported. And they had very effective ways of controlling people. The one that I resonated with, because we had such young kids, if you were a known dissident, if you spoke up publicly, your very smart kid was not going to go to university. And your talented pianist kid was not going to the conservatory. And they would control people by making it clear that the kids would pay the price. And I think most of us would be unwilling to do that to our children. And it was another reason why I admired the dissidents so much. They just said,
they put everything on the line. Those people,
100%.
Everything on the line.
Yeah. And with no realistic expectation that things were going to change. When it did change, everyone was thrilled and astounded. But
so you mentioned that you had 3 children.
Actually, 4.
4. Oh, can you talk a little bit about raising your children overseas and maybe how you saw that affect them? Because I know that my 2 children were also at the beginning in elementary school. They were raised overseas.
Yeah, I think it worked out, and I believe my children definitely agree. It worked out really well for all of us. I was watching all the time to see how they were doing, because we didn't go to one country and stay there for 6 years. We moved a lot. And I think children are kind of the ultimate conservatives. They want everything to stay the same, their friends, their school, their home, their routines. And my children, I remember when we arrived in Prague, our oldest was 4, and I was tucking him into bed, and he said, "Mommy, in 3 years, we have to move again, right?" You're already worrying about that. You just got here. But they did think about it, and they did, and it affects different children. Different children perhaps are more sensitive and so forth. So later on, some years later, we were serving in Moscow, and the kids were all older. At that point, we did have 4, and the youngest was 4 years old. But the older ones, even without having learned to read Cyrillic, they would go with friends to the big swimming pool, for example, and they knew the first 3 letters of the stop that they needed to get off, and the first 3 letters of our stop when they came back, and they just went with it, even though, and if they needed it, they would have been able to find someone who understood English or could help them out, but they didn't let it hold them back. And they, 2 of them now live abroad, and all of them at different times, Peace Corps and for other reasons, have lived and worked abroad. So I think it enriched their lives.
I think that it does enrich. We did a lot of traveling where we did long 3-week vacations. And instead of coming home to the U.S. for the holidays, we would go off quite the adventure, not your typical thing. But it also changed the kids because when they came back to the U.S., just the way that they perceived other children, other races, even going to the grocery store was a different kind of experience. It was all pretty wonderful. And I think it embedded itself in their brains, and they were much more open, I think, in terms of understanding other cultures. So it was all good.
Yeah.
To our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Empowered Life Lessons of Everyday Women. We would really appreciate if you could leave us a rating or a review. If you have any challenges or questions you are facing, we want to hear from you as we value your input and suggestions. And if you have a compelling story or life lesson you would like to share, please connect with us at empoweredlifelessons@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, other social media platforms, or visit us at empoweredlifelessons.com. In our next episode, Michele B. continues to share her experience as the ambassador to the Kingdom of Lesotho, the importance of the consular tenants, and becoming the Assistant Secretary for Consular Affairs.